Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Zimmt. I'm a research associate here at the INSS Iran program. As the Iran protests enter its third month already, it seems that the regime is stepping up its deadly crackdown on demonstrators. Nevertheless, the protesters seem as determined to continue their struggle under the slogan, Women, Life, Liberty, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. To discuss the longest and most significant domestic challenge to the Islamic Republic since the Islamic Revolution, I'm extremely happy to be joined today by two experienced and knowledgeable colleagues of mine, Sanam Vakil and Holy Dagres. Dr. Sanam Vakil is the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa Program, where she leads project work on Iran and the Gulf Arab dynamics. Sanam's research focuses on regional security, Gulf geopolitics, and on future trends in Iran's domestic and foreign policy. Holy Dagres is a non-resident senior fellow at the Washington-based think tank, the Atlantic Council. She is also the editor of the Council's Iran Source blog and curator for the weekly newsletter, The Iranist. She's also the author of a groundbreaking report, Iranians on Social Media. So good morning and afternoon, Sanam and Holy. Let me first apologize, Holy, for the early hour, and Sanam for scheduling this panel at the middle of the Iran-Britain football game. But anyway, Holy, let me start with you, please. As we all know, the protests in Iran have been very dynamic. Could you please give us a short update on the current situation inside Iran?
Absolutely. Raz, it's an absolute delight to be with INSS again, albeit not in person. So as you've noted, we're now in month 3 or day 66 of the protests that began on September 16 after the murder of Mahsa Jina Amini at the hands of the morality police. So since then, we've seen that these protests have spread to all 31 of Iran's provinces and have captured the attention of Iranians across the socioeconomic spectrum. From what we've seen in the latest, according to an organization known as Human Rights Activists in Iran, their latest numbers from yesterday say that 419 have been killed, and of that number, 60 were children, and they've had over 17,000 arrested. So these numbers are people actually accounted for and verified, and human rights organizations believe them to be much, much higher. One thing that's key about protests in Iran is that they become normalized since the December 2017, January 2018 protest. And while every mass protest has been different, such as the 1999 student uprising after the closing of Salam newspaper, or the 2009 post-election protest known as the Green Movement that was prompted by a fraudulent election, and the bloody November 2019 anti-government protests where we saw security forces arrest and kill thousands, these protests really stand out from all the rest because of their continuity. We haven't never seen a protest in Iran continue for every day straight. I also want to focus on the fact that, yes, women are removing their headscarves, they're burning their headscarves and cutting their hair in solidarity with Mahsa Jina Amini. But these protests are not about mandatory hijab, but the status quo. So Iranian protesters are saying very loud and clear that they no longer want an Islamic Republic. And this isn't just evident in their mobilization on the streets, but also in their chants, things from death to the dictator, death to the principle of Velayat Faqih, freedom, freedom, freedom. I will fight, I will die, I will take back Iran. And I know that a lot of people talk about 2009 being a social media uprising, but I actually think that that's not accurate. I believe these protests are a social media uprising. So in the context of 2009, protests were mobilized actually by word of mouth and text message. And it was actually families and friends in the diaspora that amplified social media footage of protesters being brutally beaten and killed by security forces in 2009. These current protests, however, started with a photo of Mahsa Jina Amini unconscious and hooked up to an ICU unit at the hospital, and it went viral online with the hashtag in Persian Mahsa Amini. So when she died 3 days later on September 16, thanks to social media and messaging apps, which I should note, Iranians have to use circumvention tools to actually use things like Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube and Facebook, although Instagram has only been recently blocked due to the protests. So anyone basically with a cell phone knew what had happened to Mahsa Amini and were outraged by the news. That shared anger online actually poured into the streets. And I think you can maybe arguably liken it to what we saw in the Arab Spring in 2011 with Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia or Khalid Said in Egypt. And I hope we'll talk about this a little bit later, but these protests are actually led by Iranian Generation Z or Gen Z with women at the forefront. So a lot of the protesters on the street are women and often under the age of 25, and they've led these protests in a way that we haven't seen before in modern Iran.
Thank you, Holly. Sanam, it seems to me that the Iranian regime is still incapable of calming down those protests, but it also seems that the protesters at this stage, at least, don't have the power to pose an immediate threat to the stability of the regime. So in your view, what does it take for this, I would say, revolutionary situation or revolutionary moments to evolve into a real revolution, which could pose a real threat to the security, to the stability of the regime?
You would think this was the first time I was on Zoom. Thank you, Roz, and thank you to the INSS for having me. Sorry we can't be with you in person, but happy to share some quick reflections on, I think, what is a really critical issue. Holly did a great job describing the current scope and trajectory of the protests today. I would like to just perhaps as a counterweight be the voice of caution here, because as you sort of implied in your question, Roz, while these protests are indeed have been sustained into their 9th week, and the level of national participation is unprecedented, there are a few headwinds and challenges and realities on the ground that we should pay attention to. Firstly, yes, protests have spread to all 31 provinces. We've seen protests in numbers of cities, but what we are not seeing are numbers. And I think it's important not to discount what we're seeing because of the numbers, but at the same time, for these protests, and I don't think they're revolutionary yet, and I would caution us against characterizing them as revolutionary, because revolutions don't happen in a 3-month period to an institutionalized system that has been quite sedimented and rules on the basis of a bureaucratic state rather than personalized power. I would say that we should be looking for more mobilization, more individuals on the streets, and building beyond the cleavages that we are witnessing. Again, and those cleavages, it's important to note, are quite small scale in number. We have seen Kurds and Baluch protests. We've seen young people, primarily young women and young men protest. We have seen some support coming from Iranian merchants, but we haven't seen sort of the broad strikes that are also considered to be very important. And mobilization has to extend beyond the youth to bring out actually the majority of the Iranian population, which is middle-aged and middle class. And I've said this before, and I'm very happy to say it again, as a middle-aged, middle-class person, the middle-aged and the middle class don't demonstrate in the same way that young people do. I used to go to a lot of protests when I was young. I haven't been to a protest in a long time. And that's because middle-aged, middle class are cautious, worried about tomorrow, worried about food on their table. And without structure, organization, and a plan, those are key elements to generate more popular support, and those elements are missing. I think Iranians are very much in revolt, and the younger generation in Iran are very much in revolt. But what we don't have a sense of is exactly what is to come in the future. There's consensus perhaps that a large portion of the Iranian society know what they don't want. And I can't even say that with a great degree of confidence. But what we don't know specifically is what they want. What comes next? What does that look like? What is the system that's supposed to come? Who is going to be involved? And how do you get there? And in my sort of assessment and analysis of the statements and discussion coming out of Iran, there hasn't been any sort of organization or thinking in terms of next steps. And those are very key and necessary ingredients to get there. And secondly, in terms of the political establishment in Iran, I think that there is a bit of a stalemate going on because yes, we're in its 9th week and that political establishment hasn't cracked down in the way that we saw in November 2019. This is causing questions, raising alarm. Perhaps some people think that there are divisions among the political establishment. And again, I would turn to the fact that the Islamic Republic is an institutionalized middle class, middle-aged state. This is a system that is based and supported by a very large population. Important to note that Iran's population is 85 million people. And in these protests, which haven't, again, exceeded in terms of numbers on the street to what we saw in 2019 or in 2009, I think the political establishment recognizes that this is a very youthful revolt, and the optics and the difficulties of killing young people, while they are not afraid to kill plenty of people, it is causing a bit of a challenge. And so they're trying a different approach, acknowledging perhaps that this is going to be a longer and perhaps steady stream of a revolt or uprising, or however we would like to characterize it.
Thank you, Sanam. Ho, you mentioned the Z generation that is born in the 1990s, in the first decade of the 21st century, and you have recently published a very fascinating piece for the Foreign Policy entitled "Meets Iran's Generation Z, the driving force behind the protests." Could you tell us a little bit about this generation, its challenges, its demands, perhaps?
Sure. Well, Raz, as you know, Iranians don't refer to generations like millennials or Gen Z. They actually refer to them in decades. So Gen Z, those born between 1997 and 2012, are known as Dahe Hashtad, or the 80s generation, referring to the 1380s in the Iranian calendar. So this generation was born with satellite dishes, internet, and social media at their fingertips, albeit having a lot of hurdles to get by, as I mentioned earlier. And this actually makes them part of the globalized Generation Z in terms of sharing many of the same preferences and interests. So they like the same music, they like the same TV shows, they care about the same issues to an extent. And so through the internet, Gen Zers have learned not just about their country's past, but also to question their leadership and do their research, their own research, that is. So social media over the years, especially in the past 5, I would say, have given Iranian Gen Z the ability to see the misfortunes of their country in real time, be it through protests that are localized or national, violent crackdowns viewed on Instagram accounts like 1500 Tasvir or 1500 images, or instances where we've seen viral videos and pictures that show the disparity of wealth between ordinary Iranians and regime elites, with accounts such as the rich kids of Tehran. So Iranian Gen Z, they interact online a lot and watch youth in other countries live freely, particularly in the West. And Iranians recognize the injustices and hypocrisy in their own society, as well as their wasted potential. And so naturally, they don't want to accept these living standards and that they're putting up with. So this is a lot of the reason why you're seeing these Iranian youth feel disconnected with this geriatric clerical establishment, to a point where, Raz, as I think have shared with me as well, is this interest in how Iranian youth are actually using social media to make fun of and criticize the clerical establishment. For example, Ayatollah Ali Ahmad Janati, who's a 95-year-old cleric, Iranians youth make fun of him and use memes that call him prehistoric or a dinosaur. And so that should really give you a sense of how disconnected they feel. And I think what's really been tough for them is that they grow up in a situation where they see the systemic mismanagement and corruption and this rise in repression. And this is a generation that was merely children during the 2009 Green Movement. And they were just teenagers when the Bloody November 2019 or Aubin protests happened. And as they've come of age, they've felt more and more isolated with the world and hopeless. 67% of Iran's population is reportedly depressed. And so as they've grown older and see that there's not a lot of opportunities with jobs or the ability to get married or to even live their dreams or express themselves freely with how they dress, or I'm going to refer to Baraya for the sake of that song by Shervin Hajipour, which has become the de facto anthem of these protests. You read these or hear these lyrics that were actual tweets. Like, Iranians really want ordinary, basic things. They want the ability to dance in the streets, to kiss their lover in the streets, and of course, freedom. And so these things are what Iranian youth want. And so this is why they're leading the charge in a way that their parents haven't. And so one thing I'm going to draw attention to is what a 22-year-old protester had written in an open letter to the world, and why they want the world to be the voices of the people of Iran. And she said, "This time we will not be silenced by the government's bullets. For every fallen, many rise up in the name of freedom." So one thing I would say is that this generation of Iranians who are protesting for the first time are a force to be reckoned with. And I really don't think we should underestimate them. And I think it's not just an Iranian Gen Z thing, it's a Gen Z thing worldwide. We just saw how even in the US, how Gen Z somewhat played a big part in the US midterms. So they are really a force to be reckoned with.
Fascinating. Sanam, we've seen some voices over the last few weeks, even within the conservative establishment in Iran, calling to consider perhaps some concessions to the protesters, even concerning the issue of enforcement of the Islamic code risk. Do you think it's realistic to assume that over the time, perhaps the Islamic regime will be able to give some concessions to the protesters in an attempt to calm down the situation?
Raz, I think it very much depends on how long these protests last and how brutally the state cracks down. I think for the time being, there is no direct policing and oversight of veiling requirements. For example, in and around Iran, we see more and more accounts of women very bravely going out without their hijabs and dressing and however they would like. And that seems to have been tolerated and accepted by the state so far. Many of these children have parents and family members who are part of the political establishment. And I think that there is an awareness within the state that young people are indeed seeking greater social freedom as a first step. If not, let's just add to that economic opportunity as well as political agency. So the social freedom, at least in terms of dress and behavior, seems to be something that the state could easily offer ordinary people. I don't think it would, if we go down that avenue, it wouldn't happen in some formal legal parliamentary legislative maneuver, but rather take place in the way most change comes to the Islamic Republic, in an informal way, where there is tolerance granted towards a change in dress and a sort of overlooking of past practices. I think for the state to formally alter legal norms would prove to be quite difficult. The political establishment is divided between conservatives and conservatives who are neoconservative, as well as pragmatic political leaders who together, I think, remain still quite united in the preservation of the Islamic Republic, are committed to protecting the security and stability of the Islamic Republic. So while they might grant these social liberalizations, it remains to be seen, at least from my perspective, if the political establishment if there are rifts within the political establishment in terms of what to do next, and if there will be a struggle for power and a marginalization of more pragmatic political elites, as we've already seen. Reformists have indeed sat out these protests. They haven't been politically engaged in any way. They have had to showcase their unity for the political establishment. And so I do wonder if even pragmatic conservatives might also get pushed out, because the Iranian religious leadership and neoconservative leadership is very much directed at managing security from within, as well as external security crises, and very much see compromise ultimately as a sign of weakness, and compromise as a first step that will beget further weakness, both from abroad as well as from within. So we're still very much in the fog of this. It's hard to be predictive about what could come next. We just have to stay tuned, really.
I would still want to get your view on two main issues. One is your assessment on the outcome of this protest, and second thing, what do you think the West, the United States and Europe, could and should do to support those protests? Holly, please.
Well, that's a big undertaking. Well, I think Sanam made some very valid points. I think the one thing we have to note, I think when you look at what's happening on the ground, I remember hearing a very prominent academic describe it as a pre-revolutionary period. And, you know, when I look at what's happening, as I noted, there's continuity there, and I just don't see things going back to the way they used to be. Even if they were to make these so-called reforms or concessions, maybe allow women to not wear mandatory hijab anymore. And we've already been seeing this with viral pictures and videos of women jogging without hijab. I even posted a video of a woman that I was shocked to see wear a mini skirt and boots out, and she was getting honked. People were honking at her in solidarity. I think you might see these kind of things happen, but without actually announcing them. But this is not the issue. This isn't what Iranians are out in the streets for. They're done with the clerical establishment. They do not want an Islamic republic. And until that is addressed, you're not going to see these protests end anytime soon. I mean, we're talking about people that know full well that if they go to the streets, they're going to be beaten to death with batons or shot to death by security forces. And they're willing to take that risk out of desperation, because that's how fed up they are, because they know they have two options here. They know that one option is they leave. Iran has a history of brain drain. They could do that just like many others, or they rise up and they fight this. And when I talk to Iranians on the ground that haven't partaken in these protests, they actually say that they're waiting for the right opportunity. They don't really say what that is, but for example, maybe that right opportunity would be when Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei dies, or the clerical establishment shoots itself in the foot yet again and does something that evokes further anger. We've seen in recent years them do a lot of things that really angered Iranians and made them take to the streets. So I think that there's definitely room for more masses of people to take the streets. But as Sanam said earlier, we're not there yet. Yes, it is a widespread protest in terms of it being nationwide, but the numbers aren't there. And I know that people have been meeting this with skepticism, and I've said this repeatedly. The protesters don't need our skepticism, they need our support. And so just talking a bit about what the West can do and your Western governments and whatnot can do. I mean, I think for starters, I'm going to go in different directions, but there's a lot of Iranian dissidents coming out of the country. They're going to places like Dubai, to Istanbul in Turkey, to Tbilisi, Georgia. They need to expedite visas for these dissidents that are leaving the country or in hiding right now, because the Islamic Republic has a history of transnational repression. We just saw the other month, while these protests were happening, a legendary football player by the name of Ali Karimi, who's given so much solidarity to these protests, they almost tried to lure and kidnap him back to Iran to use him as a tool and forcibly confessed whatever they had in mind on national television. So they're definitely in the business of doing this. And of course, we've seen a history of this transnational repression. Other things that the Western governments need to do is not mince their words, stop being so diplomatic. Iranians don't need to hear these comments of basically that are akin to thoughts and prayers. They want to hear heartfelt messages. And I think this is where the Biden administration has fallen behind on with messaging, and they've slowly been catching up, but there's still a lot of room to be improved. And of course, there's a lot of things they can do on the multilateral front. The United Nations has a lot of opportunities. I know that right now, as we speak, there are human rights groups right now in Geneva trying to get Iran kicked off the Commission for the Status of Women. So there's a lot of opportunity, but I think more importantly, there needs to be accountability. In a multilateral setting, the Islamic Republic needs to be held accountable for its actions against these protesters and for these brutal crackdowns over the years. And we haven't really seen that. And I'm really hoping that this time around, with the international attention on Iran, media attention on Iran, that this happens.
Thank you, Holly. Sanam, any last comments?
Yes, of course. I mean, with regards to steps from the international community, I strongly echo Holly. Of course, a showcase of solidarity is very important. But it's important at the same time to recognize that this is a protest movement that is indigenous, that is being catapulted and motivated from Iran by indigenously based Iranians. And there's very little that people in the diaspora or in the international community can do beyond providing symbolic signs of mobilization. I personally feel very cautious and uncomfortable calling for young people to go out on the streets and put themselves in harm's way while I'm comfortably sitting in London. And I'm also equally humble in my calls for young Iranians and older Iranians to go on strike when they don't have resources to get by on a day-to-day basis. So I think that there is a level of organization that probably needs to develop abroad to support any kind of protest movement, to give it sustainability, and that requires a bit more thinking. From the international community, though, we do have a huge problem vis-a-vis Iran. This problem has been mounting and developing for well over 1 decade, with a very fragile, if not non-existent JCPOA in sight, and with opposition groups and members of the diaspora strongly encouraging the international community not to negotiate with the Islamic Republic on its nuclear program. There is a rebound effect to this action. The goal of people here is to weaken and destabilize the Islamic Republic so that we could have a different political leadership come to power. But the consequence of not engaging with the Islamic Republic over its nuclear program is that the Islamic Republic is becoming closer and closer to a threshold state, and we might even qualify that it is a threshold state. Its takeaway from the war in Ukraine is that nuclear weapons are one of the key ingredients that have helped President Putin survive further aggression from Western states, and it sees its nuclear program as its most valuable asset, an asset that it will not surrender or give up in JCPOA negotiations. And this puts us in a stalemate or in a standoff with Iran, where what we will get in a longer phase and in a rebound effect of these policies is that we will have not less Islamic Republic, but more Islamic Republic, and a more entrenched Islamic Republic with nuclear weapons. So what does this require the international community to deliberately do? To think collectively about what the red lines and policies towards Iran can and should be. What are Western countries willing to do to defend Iranian protesters and at the same time protect themselves from what is likely to be a very aggressive nuclear threshold, if not operationalized Iranian nuclear program? And I think this is a big question for everyone to consider going forward. And I don't have the answers, unfortunately, but these are the questions that we are discussing to try and define what the parameters are and what the next steps are.
Dr. Sanam, Vakil, Holy Dagres, it's always a pleasure hearing you, and I hope to see you very soon here in Israel in person.
Thank you. Take care.